Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our program on the drivers of change in China-Latin America relations. As you can see, I am not Robert Daly. My name is Ray Zong. I'm the program associate here at the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. I'm filling in for Robert as moderator today. We are thrilled to have with us Margaret Myers, who is one of our Wilson Fellows this year. She is the director of the Asia and Latin America program at the Inter-American Dialogue. Her research here at the Wilson Center looks into the details of China-Latin America relations based on case studies and the complex relationships between not just the states, but then subgroups and factions and players in those politics. She's co-edited volumes of The Political Economy of China-Latin America and The Changing Currents of Trans-Pacific Integration. She's testified before Congress and regularly featured in major domestic and international media, and has taught at Georgetown University, the George Washington University, and my graduate alma mater, Johns Hopkins SAIS. She's worked at as a Latin America analyst and China analyst for the U.S. Department of Defense. Discussing Margaret's research today is our very own Bruna Santos, who is director at the Wilson Center's Brazil Institute. She was the VP and Innovation Director at the National School of Public Administration in Brazil, and director at Comunitas, a NGO dedicated to promoting social development. And on a China-related note, she lived in Beijing from 2010 to 2013, where she worked as a market analyst at China Tex Grains and Oils and co-founded a PR firm called Radar China. She was an Eisenhower Fellow and adjunct professor at Columbia's EMPA Global. And with our introductions all set, I will turn it over to Margaret for her excellent work that she's been working on at the Wilson Center.
Well, thank you, Ray, for the very kind introduction. It is such a pleasure to be here. I see a lot of familiar faces, which is so wonderful, but also look forward to meeting those of you who I haven't met before. Before I get started, I'd like to first of all thank the Wilson Center for having me. This is my second to last day as a fellow here at the Wilson Center, and it's bittersweet for sure. This has been a fantastic experience, an opportunity to kind of get this book off the ground at the very least. I should note that this is not a launch. This is more of an update, a very, very early preview of what is to come. I've finished 4 chapters here, and so we'll be working on finishing the remainder of the book over the next year, and then hopefully having it out shortly after that. So I'll keep you updated, in other words. But also, I mean, not just the Wilson Center in general, but the programs with which I'm affiliated, the Latin American program, obviously, and the entire staff there has been exceedingly supportive of this work and provided a lot of insight. The Kissinger Institute, thank you so much, Ray, for organizing this, for stepping in, and also to Robert Daly for his guidance. To Bruna, from whom I've learned so much in just a short period of time during your after your arrival here just a number of months ago. And also for taking the time to comment on this presentation. So it's been a fantastic, very short tenure here at the Wilson Center, and I look forward to staying engaged in whatever form possible. As Ray mentioned, my other hat is as director of the Asia and Latin America program at the Inter-American Dialogue. For those who aren't familiar, it's a Western Hemisphere affairs think tank based here in Washington, D.C., been around for about 40 years. And I've been running what's called the Asia Latin America program there for a period of 12 years. So it's been a long time, and then prior to that, looked at this relationship in other capacities, including through research in China and within the U.S. government. So this project, this book, I feel fortunate because it's in part a passion project. It's in part something that I've wanted to do for a very long time. When you look at in depth at the China-Latin America dynamic for as long as many of us have, right? You accumulate some very interesting stories. And so this is in part an effort to tell those stories, right? To share those fascinating stories with a wide-ranging audience. It's not a particularly academically focused book, more journalistic than anything else, renderings, case studies. But on the other hand, is an effort to address what I perceive to be a sense, not just here in Washington, but broadly, that China, or the China-Latin America relationship in general, whether we're talking, in the economic dimension or political or otherwise, is driven by Chinese policy largely, by Chinese strategy or platforms, be it the Belt and Road Initiative or any number of other, strategies or platforms that have been announced, including very recently, through China's own ambitions or even grand strategy. And indeed, that plays a fundamental role in a lot of what's happening. China's interests, be it in the form of, food security or energy security interests and calculus, indeed have driven so much of what China is doing in the region late, as do directives, guidance coming from major ministries, some of the policies that have been articulated, toward the Latin American region in particular. So it's not as though, these things do not shape the relationship. But when you look, for those of us who do work on this topic, we understand innately that it's a much more complex story. And there are so many wide-ranging actors and factors that shape developments and outcomes on the ground every day in various ways. And so this is, as much as it is a passion project, it's also an effort to sort of demonstrate what I call the tangled web of overlapping interactions and the kaleidoscopic cast of characters at play in this relationship at various administrative levels, frankly, in the national level, state or provincial level, and municipal level, across the board. It's also an effort to convey the agency of Latin American actors in this process, right? This is not, in many cases, you see Latin American actors actually promoting so much of what's happening on the ground, coming up with the ideas themselves and taking it to various Chinese banks or companies, presenting these ideas. And they needn't be commercial actors necessarily, but really any number. And so what I'm attempting here, and this is the proposed title, we'll see what ends up happening to it, but in any case, it's Twisted Roots, the Drivers of Change in Modern China-Latin America Relations. Twisted Roots is derived from the Chinese idiom pangancuojie, which means twisted roots and intertwined joints, or in other words, things that are exceedingly complex. So inherent in this relationship is a complex and interwoven dynamic of actors and factors that are shaping things at all times. And each one of these stories that I'll be telling, I'm not going to tell all of them today in depth, but I'm happy to go into them in Q&A if of interest, try to exemplify that dynamic. So let me, here I have control. Okay, great. This idea was born of some research that we did a number of years ago and continue doing at the Inter-American Dialogue. This is one report that came out in 2020 called Going Local, an assessment of China's administrative level activity in Latin America and the Caribbean, which explores, the number of actors, both Chinese, right, and Latin American, that are shaping dynamics, commercial, political, and otherwise, at the local level, meaning at the state or provincial level or at the municipal level, in this relationship and how that is shaping up and how those interactions play out in many cases. So that sparked a lot of the idea for the book. As many of you in the room know, the China-Latin America relationship has been, China's engagement with Latin America was evident many decades ago. It's not a, new relationship in its entirety, but this enhanced period of Chinese engagement with Latin America and the Caribbean, for that matter, really began in the mid-1990s. And in these early phases of engagement, there was indeed, a reliance on, at least on the part of Chinese actors, right, on a handful of very clearly articulated objectives. For those who do, China global studies, we all hear in depth and probably too much about the going out strategy and the three tenets of the strategy and how much those guided engagement at this particular moment in time, especially by state-owned enterprises, into specific sectors in the region. There was also a tendency at this period of time, early on in the relationship, to rely on personal relationships, the cultivation of personal relationships with leaders in the region, both to ensure access to markets, but also to ensure that deals would progress more or less as intended. Did that always happen? No, and we can talk a little bit about that. But a good example of that is this fascinating story, which I read in a book an autobiography by Chen Yuan, who was the chairman of China Development Bank at the moment when China Development Bank became more or less took on a commercial objective, more or less, became commercialized to a considerable degree and began investing extensively in places like the Middle East and North Africa, also in Venezuela, for example, and other parts of the world, and grew at a rapid pace. Chen Yuan was very interested in engaging with Venezuela. He was very interested in promoting this model of commodity-backed lending, or in the case of Venezuela, oil-backed lending, and saw Venezuela as a destination of interest at this particular period in time. This was in the early 2000s. And this is just an example, exemplifies the extent to which these personal dynamics really did shape so much of what was happening in the overall relationship. So he wrote about this in his book, and he said he didn't know how to get into Venezuela. He didn't know Hugo Chavez. He didn't understand the Venezuelan political dynamic or the economic landscape particularly well. The petroleum sector, the oil sector, was also not something that had been well studied in China. And so he went, naturally, I suppose, to Cuba, to Fidel Castro, and spoke with Fidel. And he said, I strongly recommend that I make an introduction to Hugo Chavez. I agree that Venezuela is an excellent place to begin operations, and was integral in establishing that initial connection, and indeed in helping to facilitate some of the loan agreements, which have, over time at least, comprised the vast majority of China Development Bank and, frankly, Exim Bank lending to the region. So, this reliance on these partnerships, started a long time ago on these personalistic ties to make things happen, but they became increasingly problematic over time. I think probably the best, I'm sure there are a lot of examples that you may have from your own research or observations, and I'd love to hear about them. But one of the best examples is Argentina. And we write about this a lot in the study, the Going Local study, but also I reference this in the book to a degree. In Argentina, there have been some, dramatic shifts, political shifts over time. During the Cristina Kirchner administration, there were a number of deals struck with China, often through sort of preferential agreements that were established by the Kirchner administration. When Macri became president, there was a process of revisiting these deals, rethinking these deals, and in certain cases, the finance that had been allocated to develop certain projects, for example, a couple of dams in Santa Cruz province, which is Cristina Kirchner's home province, were withheld. The money was withheld from that province. And as a result, withheld from the companies that were doing these things, and people were not paid for a period of a year and a half in certain cases. And these were huge problems. They were problems from an operational perspective, obviously, but also a reputational perspective. China was looking to get these dams done, to demonstrate capacity to do so. And so this was, hugely problematic. And China realized that this is not an exclusively Argentina-related phenomenon. There are a lot of shifts politically, across the region. Obviously, Brazil is a good example of how this works. And to circumvent a lot of the sort of national level political challenges that China and others have encountered, especially in trying to move forward certain deals that were struck during certain administrations. One way to do that is to go to the subnational level, to work with municipalities in certain cases, or to work with states or provinces. And indeed, that's what's happened in the case of Argentina. So it's happened in a number of other sort of federalized systems across the region. And in general, there's been an interest on the part of Chinese actors in localizing their activity. This is something else. This is something that is mentioned with considerable frequency right now, during the or has been over the course of the López Obrador administration in Mexico, as there are growing and continuous uncertainties about the regulatory landscape there, especially in sectors of interest to Chinese companies. So going local, going to Querétaro, doing your investment in places where it makes sense to do investment is sort of the way to go. So there's been, a localization process, a professionalization process, I suppose we could call it as well, a rethinking of the ways in which, these deal-making ought to be approached, but also market access, risk mitigation, all of these things that are continuously being rethought by Chinese actors. And so what we see now, is what I call multi-tiered diplomacy. By that I mean, certainly there's not been an abandonment of bilateral engagement, and still extensive effort, to engage with leaders across the region to ensure strong ties and to shape environments to whatever extent through convenios, through memorandums of understanding, through all sorts of other bilateral agreements, whatever it may be, to shape them to be conducive to the interests of the Latin American countries involved, but also to China's various interests, be they economic or political. So the bilateral dynamic remains critical, fundamental, still is an important feature. But we've seen also over time, and really mostly since 2015, a real focus on regional engagement, including through something that's called the China-CELAC Forum. You can see here, Foro Chino-CELAC, right? Well, it has it in many languages, but this is just a copy of their webpage. But there are meetings every 3 years of ministerial meetings, but also wide-ranging other sort of forums that are established, ministerial forums, agricultural minister forums, civil society forums, environmental forums, really you name it, that have been established under the umbrella of the China-CELAC Forum, which builds obviously on CELAC, but is its own entity. There's been a lot of work, and I'm sorry this is so small, but to establish agreements at the bilateral level about the need to engage more extensive locally. So a real indication of interest in doing so, but an effort also to formalize this process. So to welcome and expand, for example, partnerships between provinces, Chinese provinces and Latin American provinces or states, right? Between cities, sister cities arrangements. We have these here in the US, but in the context of Latin America, China's sister cities and sister provinces arrangements have been exceedingly productive. And I'll talk a little bit so I'll give some examples of those. Who's doing this? When we think about the Belt and Road Initiative, I don't know, it's not mentioned with as much frequency as it used to be, obviously, and I think, there's always been a sort of continuous rethinking of the BRI and what it ought to be. It's a bit of a fluid concept, but it's at least initially it was intended as an effort to promote connectivity in various forms. Infrastructure is what we think of, right? But there's also financial connectivity, there's policy coordination, there's trade facilitation, which is a very big part of this, and then there's people-to-people connectivity. And my sense, at least, is that in the as much as trade and investment and infrastructure and all of these things continue to be present in Latin America, there's been a concerted effort really to focus so much on policy coordination and people-to-people connectivity, especially amid the pandemic. And so there are a number of institutions carrying these things out. They're governmental institutions, and you can see those on the left-hand side in the sort of dark green column. These are some examples. It's certainly not the entire range. There are party institutions, right? International Liaison Department, for example, does a lot of work across the board, especially with legislators. And then there are sort of quasi-governmental institutions or organizations, and these are wide-ranging. They achieve different objectives. But in many cases, at the local level, just to give you a sense of the breadth of this activity and like all of the actors and factors that are shaping outcomes in certain instances, right, you'll see all of these, or at least a considerable chunk of them present, right, doing activity, not necessarily coordinated, but serving similar, broad interests and objectives. So my challenge here is to see exactly what it is that I'm supposed to be talking about on this slide. So this is just a case study that, again, this is not part of the book, but has been largely the impetus for getting going on a lot of the chapters that I've been writing, and I'll talk about the book second, but this is a timeline and a case study that we did related to China, this is Coquimbo Chile engagement. And Coquimbo is a region in Chile that has considerable mining resources, but is also of interest to China because of the possibility of building what's called the Agua Negra Tunnel, which I suppose, presumably, if you look at sort of a map of all of the transport infrastructure in Latin America, could carry, Argentine commodities in addition to other products, from rail that's being developed right now by Chinese companies in Argentina through the Agua Negra Tunnel to potentially the Chilean coast, or at least there's been proposals of routes of that sort. This is a 10-year interest in engaging with Coquimbo. And you can see the wide range of, well, you probably can't see it because it's so small, and I apologize for that. But there have been such a wide range of actors at play, looking to facilitate what is a potential productive relationship with the Coquimbo region in Chile. So there's the Henan province, Coquimbo, Chile, and San Juan, Argentina, sort of partnership, which there's a sister provinces partnership, involved there, but also a lot of conferences, meetings, events, discussions that are held among these various actors. The Professional Association of Chinese Business People, so Overseas Chinese, has been involved also in trying to promote more in the way of Chinese commercial activity in this region. You can see some of the names there of some of the conferences that have been held and what their focuses are. La Serena University, which is a university in the region, and the Henan government have been doing some joint exploration, or at least research on exploration and copper exploration. And then Wang Hening, who is who is a sort of really interesting business person who is active across the southern cone, has also been evident, working in this region in addition to a lot of other parts of Argentina, Chile, to advance potential commercial sector agreements, especially in these sectors of interest. And so what's notable about this is the number of resources that have been committed, but not a lot has happened, right? 10 years, more than 12 years now of partnership and of a lot of exchange, but without much evidence of commercial activity. The Jujuy relation stands in stark contrast to the Coquimbo relationship. Jujuy province is a province in Argentina, And similarly, we saw expansive activity on the part of educational institutions, party organizations, certainly the embassy, delegations of business people, and Guizhou province representatives too, given that that's the sister province for Huhui. Over the period, with exchanges back and forth, right, over the period of 5 years. After 5 years, there were 4 major agreements struck in the area of surveillance technology through ZTE. In the solar industry, there was support for the Cauchari project, right, which is the largest solar project in South America, lithium exploration activity in support of eventual deal making in that sector, and then a big data center that was again supported by Guizhou, which is doing some of the same things in China. So a lot happened in this particular relationship, and this is an example of really effective allocation of human and financial resources in support of commercial deal making, even in advance of these projects even being conceived. In a formal fashion, right? So this is, and this is not an isolated example. This is what's happening in so much of the region at present. What I should also note here, if we're talking about the co-production of this relationship, right, and the agency of Latin American actors, so much of this was promoted by the government of Huhui. This is not just a China thing, right? This is not Chinese actors descending on Huhui and deciding that, they want to make things happen and making them happen. Gerardo Morales, the governor of Huhui, was, extremely active, and so was his deputy, right, in making these things happen, went to China many times, is on so many Chinese tarmacs, it's hard to count them all, but did a lot of this agreement. And so did, Argentine universities that are based in Huhui. There's a lot of outreach also on the Argentine side. And in fact, right now, they're looking to expand Cauchari to phases 4 and 5 to make it a bigger overall project. At this moment, though, they're having trouble attracting Chinese finance. And we can talk a little bit about why that might be. But we are at something of a different phase now, just in the past 1 or 2 years, wherein China's operating with fewer resources to bring to bear and is being, in my view at least, much more selective in its decision-making about allocation of resources in Latin America and elsewhere, for that matter. Just some examples of the wide-ranging companies, actors that's Gerardo Morales. But Ganfeng, right, was very important in some of the lithium deals. There were a number of universities involved. There was an Argentine, the Servicio, the Geologic Service, right, mining service, a number of others. But this is sort of cross-cutting, cross civil society, right, but government institutions involved as well. This process of decentralization is really quite interesting, and was evident also during the COVID-19 pandemic, wherein we saw, and this is a bit of an aside again from the book, but just demonstrates, again, the wide-ranging actors and factors involved in this process, right? What we saw in China's COVID-19 response, and I know that Francisco is tracking this very closely, so could probably comment during Q&A as well, but was a remarkable decentralization of sort of authority on the part of Chinese actors to carry things out on the ground. Certainly, many were sent forth in support of a pandemic response led by China. But their decision-making, their timelines were established seemingly by the institutions themselves. And so here you can see Chinese provinces that were involved, right? You see Chinese companies that were involved, and then government and other actors that were involved. And what was really unique about this, and about, you don't tend to think about Chinese processes as being all that decentralized, but in this case they were, and in many cases they are, right? And this enabled a considerable degree of agility, responsiveness, flexibility, especially at the onset of the pandemic and amid the distribution of PPE. So that when there was an outbreak in one place, there could be a rapid transition focus, shift in focus then to another place where there may be another outbreak, and resources allocated as needed, right, and in a timely manner. This is something that, obviously the U.S. struggled with to a degree, and then others have as well. So the agility that China was able to demonstrate through this decentralized process was really quite fast. So onto the book, and I know I'm running low on time. These are some of the chapters that I've been working on here at the center, and they vary considerably. But the idea for each chapter is to, first of all, tell these stories because I personally think they're fascinating. I hope you will too. I mean, some of these characters, some of the folks that I'm profiling are deserving of their own biographies, I think, in many cases. But each chapter highlights 3 individuals who were critical in shaping overall outcomes in whatever deal or sector or bilateral or local relationship, right? And to understand how their actions and interests intersected to result in outcomes that it sometimes were favorable for some of these actors and not for others, and sometimes were very beneficial to China and sometimes were not. But it's really wide-ranging, right? So we have Juan Valdez in Beijing. Here, this is an effort to understand how Colombian coffee has been marketed to China and what a process really that has been. Certainly, this is a relationship that has been based largely on the exportation of commodities, some of them agricultural, to China. But, coffee, especially certain forms of coffee, are seen as a sort of value add within the educational realm. And so this is an important export for Colombia globally, obviously, but also to China, given the extent of that market and a growth and interest in Chinese coffee consumption over time. So who do I profile here? Well, it's the son of a famous Chinese ping pong player who migrated to Colombia. He grew up Chinese Colombian, sort of half in China, half in Colombia, and has taken residence in Shanghai and has become sort of the ambassador of Colombian coffee producers. His story is a fascinating one, the way he navigates the 2 cultures and what he has achieved over time, right, in doing so. The second is one of the farms and one of the owners of these coffee growers that has traditionally sold their very high-end coffee to Japan, but has since been outbid, or the Japanese have been outbid by Chinese buyers and are now directing most of that coffee to China, and how that particular relationship has evolved and what those auctions look like now and how they've developed these networks in China over time. And then the third is a coffee house in Shanghai that specializes in Colombian coffee, but that has been sort of at the epicenter of this transition over time, or this evolution of interest in high-end coffee in China, especially among a certain demographic, with coffee being, very much a symbol of status in certain cases, and so the role of that coffee shop in sort of articulating this vision and carrying it out and introducing a new culture within a certain portion of the population in Shanghai. So that gives you a sense of kind of how all of this comes together. Within that, there is a lot of information about the trade dynamic itself, right? Data on that and how it's evolved over time. So that's one chapter. The one I'd like to talk about in a little bit more depth is the one in yellow. I'm sure we've all heard, or most have heard, about the Nicaragua Canal. This is on the canal itself, and this has been so far it's a disastrous story, really, and but has been the most fascinating to dig into in some depth. So here are the three folks that I profile. I don't know if you all know who the person is on the left. That's the Wang Jing, who was the entrepreneur who brought the canal idea to Nicaragua. He is not a canal expert. He's a telecommunications expert, arguably. But his story is a fascinating one. He was evidently involved in gem mining in Cambodia and earned a lot of money in doing that. Later on, he became the head of a company called Xinwei, which is a satellite company, a telecommunications company, but evidently did so through connections through a bathhouse that he owned. And meeting the owner of Xinwei, who was looking to shed those assets. So he became the sort of de facto head of Xinwei through unconventional mechanisms, and in the process, became, really quite powerful within certain circles, and earned the trust of China Development Bank and a lot of support from China Development Bank to take his operations global, including to places like Ukraine, but also to Nicaragua and elsewhere. He had received a lot of support from China Development Bank to build out a satellite project in cooperation with the Nicaraguan government, and so went there under that context. He did so, over time, but in the process met the person at the bottom here, Laureano Ortega, who is the son of Daniel Ortega, the president of Nicaragua. And they struck, as I understand it, through this research, right, a fairly fast friendship. And it was through their conversations, but Wang's conversations with others, that this notion of a canal came to pass. It had been a sort of ambition of Nicaragua for many, many decades, dozens of decades, but it had never been developed. And there was an interest at the time on the part of Laureano, but certainly Ortega himself in making this a reality, in part to advance Ortega's own legacy, but also under the assumption that maybe another canal would be needed. And so this was, part of the way that this canal idea, came into being. It was quickly advanced through the National Assembly, and Wang's company, HK&D, won a concession to run this canal, which had yet to be developed, obviously, for a period of 50 years, and that could be extended to 100 years. At the same time, a canal law was established. And this canal law enabled any land around the proposed canal route, which was not determined, right, and still isn't well defined, to be expropriated for canal-related usages. It's still on the books and still can be implemented at any moment. And so you can imagine that this is hugely problematic for any of the communities that are on this canal route, which again is not well defined, so really is just anything that is deemed canal related. And so Monica Lopez, who's at the top, is one of the main attorneys, who was active in Nicaragua, has since been exiled, but was in strong opposition to this canal law, given the rights-related implications of it, and the devastating effects that it could have on so many communities along this proposed and ill-defined canal route. And so this is, again, a story of the Nicaragua Canal, its genesis, and what happened in the end was there wasn't a canal, right? There wasn't finance for the canal. China did not step into the fold. China was very cautious, frankly, the Chinese government, that is, and warned many companies not to involve themselves with Wang Jing. Wang Jing ended up losing his fortune, and when the Shanghai Stock Exchange collapsed, he was banned from the stock exchange, and has since engaged in other ventures, as you might imagine, but is not is not recognized as a sort of, entrepreneurial hero, needless to say, in China. Despite, I think he was on the front of several Fortune-like magazine covers, right, in China for a period of time. So Who won in this scenario? I don't know, but I mean the outcome I don't think is what many anticipated. I would imagine that the Ortegas, right, of all of the actors involved are those that have benefited most extensively from this process, not Wang Jing himself. But there's this law on the books that gives them considerable authority to seize property for whatever interests may be, broadly speaking, canal related. So that gives you a sense of how sometimes these things don't turn out necessarily as we think they may. Just this is the route, one of the routes that was, proposed. We go through Lake Nicaragua, right, and traverse a lot of very biodiverse territory, and you can see that any of the green too is the route, right? So that's a lot of territory, a lot of communities. Here's the law. That's a report from the stock exchange about. And this is just sort of a synopsis of the chapter itself for those who are interested. So I think I hit 20 or more. Yeah, I'll leave it there just to make sure that Bruna has significant time to comment. And I so look forward to your thoughts, observations, contributions, condemnations, whatever it may be of this project, and to a very fruitful discussion. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your very riveting talk on the cases that your book is going to dip into. I'm going to turn it over to Bruna for comments and qualifications on this exciting upcoming project.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I'm Bruna. I'm very curious for the chapter on Vargas Llosa, so I'm giving you a few minutes in the end. I want to hear a little more about it. And it's fascinating, and I think one of the main takeaways from this is how we must recognize that there is a reshuffling in the modes that China is engaging globally, both financially and politically, and also how much China is actually invested in operating in governance, in multilateral governance. I think one of the impacts that I would like to see evaluated is, for example, how much the China Infrastructure Bank and other banks have invested in Latin America, and how much it's actually taking away space of the World Bank in the region. That's one of the things I think would be very interesting to look at, since they are also engaging more and more with capital at the local level. So from the Brazil perspective, I think one of the things that is important to notice is Brazil has not yet joined the Belt and Road Initiative, but Beijing has been pushing through infrastructure, ports, and energy in the region, all the influence in the country. Also, it's important to notice that Brazil's new president is now facing a totally different China than the one that he visited in his first and second mandates back in early 2000s. I think you know that Lula's previous tenure was characterized by the establishment of BRICS, and he had a clear orientation towards the global south. But Brazil has changed, obviously, over time, and the world has changed a lot. And today, Lula finds himself needing to carefully navigate this complex geopolitical terrain, especially when it comes to U.S., China, and Russia relations. And today, what we see when it comes to Brazil in relationship with China in this much more fragmented and competitive order is Brazil's foreign policy is somehow rethinking itself. What I see emerging is a strategy of hedging, an idea of how can I navigate those complex competition without necessarily with a strategy for risk management. That's why I call it hedging, because it somehow has to guarantee flexibility and independence in the relationship with both countries, with the U.S. and with with China. However, whenever you have a hedging strategy, of course, you need a very good toolkit of tactics, and you need to be very careful in your diplomacy. You need to be have a fair amount of strategic foresight in navigating those. As Brazil aims to maintain this open communication with parties both in China and in the US, it needs to have a better understanding of the impact of those countries in the region and in each other's territory. And it's clearly something that didn't happen during the last visit of Lula to Beijing. And that's something that concerns everyone who's looking at Brazil's foreign policy right now. But one aspect that I think is very interesting to look at as an outcome from the visit was the first time I saw, for one, a delegation of 250 business people traveling to Beijing before Lula's arrival, because there was a change in that. And two is the public sphere was totally different than the one we saw, for example, during the last visit of Dilma Rousseff's visit. No think tanks, no universities, no business organizations were there as present as they were this time. And it was really impressive to see 250 people convening in Beijing and beyond business, but also a public sphere that's much more engaged in a conversation and understands China much better than before. So, of course, on the other way around, it goes without saying how well prepared the Chinese are to operate in Brazil's territory, both at the local level and at the national level. I'm always when I was in Brasilia as a VP for the National School of Public Administration, I was always very impressed with how much they knew about Brazil's education system, how much they knew about the fact that Brazil doesn't have a well-structured strategy behind the schools of government, and how much they could learn from China on that. And it's always very interesting to see how, even though it's complex, even though it's sometimes chaotic, more chaotic than we think, how well organized this operation unfolds, and how well prepared the diplomatic corps are when they are operating in Brazil. Another thing I wanted to mention is it's interesting to see how China and Brazil engage today, especially when I look at my last visit to China was in 2017. And since then, the per capita GDP of Brazil and China has changed a lot. Back in 2017, the per capita GDP of Brazil was still greater than China's, but China has now surpassed that, and today it's 40% higher than Brazil's. Also, China's economy is 10 times the size of Brazil's economy. So this is before, I think Lula, when he was negotiating with China, was more as peers. Now it's a completely different balance of power. So, as I said, many of the outcomes that came out of the visit were remarkable, but some of them, and I think it's important to observe, are the increased Chinese investment in energy and innovation and technology. 30 agreements were signed between Chinese and Brazilian companies. Other 15 were signed between both presidents, and a big portion of those were related to investments in technology and innovation. I think this shift is emblematic because it scales back it's the large-scale lending and type of operations that China had in Brazil with commodities mostly, but shows more targeted investments, more targeted actions, and especially in high-value areas. So I think beyond lithium, beyond critical minerals, the hydroelectric projects, which are huge in the region, and especially in Brazil, we see a great deal of interest in solar and wind power investments across the region. As you know, Brazil doesn't have a free trade agreement with the U.S., so cannot benefit from certain subsidies that are important right now to exploit critical minerals in the region. So China is definitely running in an advantage on that. So as to to conclude that, I think there are, of course, competing interests in putting Latin American leaders in a very tricky position right now. But I'm still elaborating on what this new hedging foreign policy means and how can Brazil and other emerging powers navigate the competition between China and the U.S. But in terms of investments, in terms of infrastructure, and how much the presence of China in the U.S. in the region will unfold, I think it's important to ask ourselves how agile in delivering those projects both organizations will be, both countries will be, because whenever it's fine to opt for financial aid with certain obligations when you have delivery, but when it comes with too many strings attached, then it takes forever to actually get the money there and implement and make that then and see the results. It's sometimes, I think, a little frustrating for the region, for Latin America, and that's some of the frustration that I see coming from Brazil when they look at the U.S. and some of the multilateral organizations here in Washington. So those are my remarks and my initial remarks, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Right?
Thank you, Bruna. So we will open it up to questions and answers soon. So please get your brief questions ready. I have a couple of questions as moderator that I've been passed along, and also it's what I'm thinking about. So my question is, as you are examining these multi-tier diplomacy, I love that term, that's going on in the region, are certain industrial or economic sectors faring better than others, and why? So we've talked about a lot of different types of goods today, from commodities to energy to mining and critical minerals, and are the sectors themselves, are there certain unique details or characteristics that are making them do well in certain projects and then poorly in other projects?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So, I mean, as a bit of context, my view, and please challenge this, I'd love to have a conversation on this, is that, I mean, when I teach my classes on China, Latin America, I tend to break things up into phases in this, enhanced. I have a couple of students in here who will be very bored by this in just a minute, but, in terms of the way that this relationship has evolved since, the mid-1990s, essentially. And I've been calling this new phase the fifth phase in the China-Latin America dynamic. And it's a phase where we're seeing a tapering of overall economic engagement. That's not to say that China's leaving by any means, but we're seeing, trade continue to underpin everything and continue to grow to a certain degree, less quickly than it has before, but nevertheless growing. Investment, China's global investment has slowed somewhat, not in volume. There's still the same number of deals. The slowing is in value. And so what does that mean? It means, I think in very large part that there's been a focusing of effort on sectors, mostly innovation-related sectors, because China's betting on these sectors to ensure GDP growth at home when you can't rely on the property market anymore. So innovation, and that's broad, that's ICT, that's, high-speed rail, that's ultra-high voltage transmission lines, that's green energy, that's all kinds of different things that are sort of higher tech, right, in nature. But it's counting on these things. And as it turns out, a lot of the decisions that are being made about implementing these technologies are being made at the municipal level. So, safe cities are for cities. Smart cities are for cities. Like, a lot of these things you need city buy-in. So that's a big reason why we're seeing so much engagement at the city level, in addition to there being, political rationale if you're having difficulty with bilateral national level bilateral dynamics and so on. So in that sector, I mean, there's a lot of focus. The extent to which it is productive or not, or there are deals made, relies on a lot of different factors, right? But there's a lot of engagement at the city level, at the state level, provincial level with those focused. And China has, in the past, I think this term has more or less dropped off the map, as they tend to do after 2 or 3 years, but this notion of new infrastructure, right, which comprises all things innovation related. But this push for new infrastructure we're seeing across the board, and especially a localized push in that particular sense. Another thing we've seen a lot of focus on of late, really in the past 2 years, is this has been a narrative since 2014, but there's been a lot more focus on this notion of reindustrialization, with both Latin American actors and Chinese actors using this term with considerable frequency, on industrial upgrading, and on economic upgrading in general, right? These have been phrases and that have used by Chinese officials to just demonstrate, to talk about what China is trying to do in the region. And indeed, a lot of the investments in these spaces too, we're seeing at the local level through special economic zones, through special agreements with, for example, Sao Paulo State to build a factory to build Huawei phones, or whatever it might be, right? But a lot of those deals too are being made at the local level. And then another area where we see a lot of localized engagement is in the area of mining. A lot of this depends on the extent to which mining-related decisions are being made at the local level. So in Argentina, it makes a lot more sense to engage with provinces, Salta, with Jujuy, whichever provinces make sense, in this respect than it does in places like Chile, where it's a much more nationalized system, right, of governance over this particular sector. But you see a lot of engagement there. And so what was it, 3, 4, 5 days ago, there was a huge, it was interesting. I mean, just in terms of the number of actors involved in this, a big scholarship agreement that was struck between university in Salta and the Chinese Ministry of Education, I believe it was, to provide a number of mining-related scholarships where Argentine students would go to China over the course of many years, right? These would be issued to study mining-related industries, and especially with a focus on lithium, I would assume, or on other, related critical minerals. So, whether these things advance or not, there certainly are focuses, right? It depends on where the resource management lies, who's in control of the resources, who has budgets, and what the applications are. But whether they are successful or not depends on wide-ranging factors, and certainly the sort of Coquimbo, Jujuy, comparison is an illustrative one in that sense, understanding what it is that has prevented something from happening in one place. And
can I just add something? I think that the fact that Brazil can absorb carbon, and the fact that Brazil can work and is already working on a certain level of regulatory harmonization on carbon markets and regulating, of course, the market, and it offers a huge opportunity for Brazilian companies and sectors to actually help China to transition to a low carbon economy. Not to mention the presence of what I already mentioned in the energy sector, solar and wind powers, but also the investments and the possibility of Brazil cooperating in this transition process and in the whole electrification of the transportation sector in the country. So this is all the important avenues that are being explored now by the private sector beyond the government, except for the harmonization of regulations so that those markets can have transactions. Those are.
Yeah, that's a great point. China's electric car battery sector has been really growing. All right. Well, I can't hog all the time to ask my questions, so I am going to go ahead and turn it over to the audience. Just a quick note that because this is a webcast event, I am going to need you to speak into one of these mics, like the ones that I have here. You can do so by pressing the button in the front of the mic or approaching one of them, like the ones near our front table, and then speaking into it at a relatively close distance. That way, our wonderful AV team here at the Wilson Center can broadcast that so that our webcast people can hear your question. Go ahead. You have to click the, yeah.
Thanks for a very wonderful presentation. My question is regarding your example of Mauricio Macri canceling the 2 dams in Santa Cruz province. We have seen some of this activity in Australia when BRI initiatives from Victoria State were cancelled by the federal government there. So the question I have is that with the polarization in Latin America from right to left, which is very sharp, do you see a tendency for, say, the right, probably in most cases, to come into power and cancel or try to push back these projects as a pattern? This particular example seemed like a product of domestic politics with Kirchner's home state and so forth. So are you seeing that sort of anti-China push from the right when they come to power in a substantive way in terms of projects, or is this just more locally driven or episodic or minimal? Thank you.
It's a really important question. So in that case, they weren't entirely canceled, right? There was a revisitation of the contract, right? And it turned out that they could not cancel the project because there was a cross default clause in the contract. So that if they did that, they would also there would be a cancellation of financing and of support for the Belgrano Cargas Railway restoration, which is something that everybody has broadly, not everybody, but it's broadly supported by, across the board, across the political spectrum, and, by the local population. And so I think there may have been interest in doing so, but it could not happen for that reason. In terms of major shifts or rethinking of projects, I mean, that's been sort of the limit, is a rethinking, a revisitation, an effort to, maybe do another environmental impact assessment, to think about changing just very slightly some of the terms of the contract to ensure less exportation of Chinese goods that are being produced locally, for example, to change the specifications for some of the turbines maybe, or something of that nature, but just very small adjustments. And yes, they are often sort of, I think, politically motivated, also motivated by a sense that maybe these deals were struck without sufficient research, or sufficient support by the wide-ranging actors who would be affected by or involved in implementing them. But I'm trying to think of any other clear examples of this happening. I mean, the most egregious example potentially is Coca-Cola in Ecuador, which has been a hugely problematic dam project, but there's not, at that point, it became operational more or less at a moment when there was, a new administration in place, and in that sense, what are you going to do other than try and manage what is, sort of a problematic asset? Yeah.
Hi, Margaret. I have a question for you on when you talked about the Nicaragua Canal and how it's built on land that is has impact on local communities and biodiversity. I just wonder if your book will think about, or is it already talks about, Chinese investments' impacts on Latin Americans' biodiversity and also native land, vulnerable land. And what do you think about how China can better protect these lands in terms of whether it's Chinese government's better regulatory system in terms of their overseas landing, like it's already under discussion, but it's not yet put forward? Or do you think it's better for Latin American governments and what you talked about, city governments, municipal governments, to request a higher standards, or request a higher regulatory standards around protecting biodiversity in native land? And just a personal interest. Yeah.
It's a terrific question. There are a lot of NGOs in China, in the region, and globally, for that matter, that are trying to understand what the best mechanisms are for shaping not just Chinese, but investment in general in these sectors that have outsized impact on the environment and on the communities involved, right? I mean, in general, the research has suggested that, if there are high standards in place locally, and they are implemented, or regulations, and both things have to happen, right? That there is an adherence on the part of Chinese companies to those, so they aren't necessarily worst performers, right, in all cases. But so much of the onus is indeed on the host countries to ensure that the regulatory environment is sufficient to address, what are, some very serious concerns. And the scale of Chinese engagement in extractives, for example, demands that there be sufficient standards in place, because the impact, of course, is tremendous. This in the lithium sector, in some of these newer emerging sectors, this is going to be largely exploratory, right? I mean, there's not a clear sense of how to manage this across the board globally. And so I think this will be an opportunity, to the extent that China can take a lead on this, in any form, but certainly others as well, on good management and, effective and sustainable supply chain management. We'll see what happens and how things evolve in these different countries. But yes, the onus is largely, in my view, on the countries themselves. That said, I should note, Becky Ray at Boston University recently put out her China, Latin America, and the Caribbean Economic Bulletin, which is fantastic. It gives you a sense of, how things have developed in 2022 from an economic perspective in the relationship. But she's finding that Chinese companies, for the second time ever, right, and globally this is a phenomenon as well, Chinese companies are bringing cases against governments for example, taking action against them for environmental or social reasons. For example, in Ecuador, there was a case in 2022 where a private company, sued the Ecuadorian government for it was canceling a contract or suspending some element of the operation due to insufficient consultation with local communities. And so on the one hand, there's adherence, right, to local standards. On the other hand, we're seeing some growing pushback, which is really quite interesting development. I don't touch on these things directly. I am exploring the possibility of doing an Amazon communities focused chapter, but it takes a bit of a different direction in that I'm trying to understand why a lot of indigenous community, sometimes uncontacted population, young people who end up going to university end up working for Chinese companies doing extractive activity in their own communities. And so there are a lot of factors that shape that. And there's one person I'm working with in Ecuador in particular to try and profile her story. So.
Hi, Margaret. This will be a terrific book. I just want to know about Vargas Llosa story.
Thank you.
If you can summarize it at least.
Maybe you can give me this is the one that I'm really struggling with, right? I mean, it's in a finished form, but I'm not happy with it because I don't know quite who the third actor / individual that I'm profiling should be. So one of the actors is obviously, I don't know how familiar everyone is with the term wolf warrior. If you haven't seen the movie Wolf Warrior, you should. It's an interesting Zhang Lang, excuse me. So in any case, wolf warriorism, right, it's a term that was used with considerable frequency, especially amid the pandemic. It's a sort of more sharp-edged sort of approach to diplomacy that we hadn't typically seen from Chinese diplomats beforehand. Very defensive, but also on the offense, often, attacking any sort of criticism of China or directly attacking U.S. Moves, observations, policies, things of that nature. It has diminished. This tendency toward wolf warrior diplomacy is not something we're seeing with the same of interest anymore. It was sort of we saw the trajectory of wolf warriorism largely aligned with Zhao Lijian's own career trajectory. For those who follow, Zhao Lijian is the spokesperson, a MOFA spokesperson who's since been relegated to a different part of the ministry. But I profile it's telling the story of voyeurism and how it intersected with, at a very sensitive moment in time, right, for China, but for globally, where tensions were high, emotions were high. Mario Vargas Llosa wrote a very critical piece in El País about China's system of governance, criticizing China's system of governance and its management of the pandemic, and was harshly attacked for that. And so the idea is to understand how voyeurism has evolved and how it intersected at a really interesting moment of time with Peru, but through Mario Vargas Llosa and his writings. So I profile Zhao Lijian, who is fascinating in his own right. He came from, a very interesting background, professional background, and ended up in this interesting position, and now we'll see what happens to him. But Mario Vargas Llosa also has had a fascinating, obviously, he's very famous, but as an author. But politically, his career has been quite interesting as well, and his ideological affiliations and interests have evolved over time, and he's spent a lot of time in China, and is well among those who are familiar at all with Latin American literature in China, is very well read. And so they are both profiled sort of simultaneously, as is the intersection of this, of the sort of Zhao Lijian, certain voyeur inclined other diplomatic voices in Latin America, and then Mario Vargas Llosa and his response to all of this. This may be the one chapter where I don't have a third component to it, because I'm really struggling to figure out. I've got a few options, but none of them fit well within the storyline, and so we'll see how that evolves. But if anyone has any ideas about how to triangulate this, I'd love to know. But that's the idea. And so the voyeur story in itself is a fascinating one. How this whole thing has evolved and why we saw it sort of drop off the map at the end of the pandemic, but yeah, the intersection of that with a lot of high-profile individuals, Mario Vargas Llosa being one of them, is sort of the idea.
So that really makes me think that Latin America is not isolated from what's going on in China, from what some of the groups that you discussed are involved in terms of Chinese foreign policy ambitions. At the same time, a lot of Chinese diaspora, many of whom live in the region, they're experiencing greater reach by some of these organizations, monitoring transnational repression, greater sort of pressure to display patriotism or pride for their roots. At the same time, you have the problem of xenophobia, which has been a lingering problem in North America, Australia, Europe, so on and so forth. So I'm wondering if this has been something that you've been observing, because not everybody can be a fancy business person that goes to hide on a yacht or something. So it's for everyday, Chinese diaspora in Latin America, I wonder how they're seeing the temperature change.
That's a fantastic question. I mean, I hear anecdotal stories, right, about the experiences of overseas Chinese communities, especially amid the pandemic, right, but it's not something that I'm equipped to to respond on. I think in any clear or educated way. And there are a couple of wonderful sociologists and anthropologists that are doing fantastic work on this topic and have written on it on a country by country basis. What I will say is, in the piece that we did on Going Local, there's a lot of involvement of overseas Chinese communities in some of these efforts, right, to engage to promote commercial activity, for example, or to engage in other forms. But that's not a commentary on their personal experiences. What is a sort of really interesting moment of tension in the U.S.-China dynamic, certainly, but amid China's growing role in wide-ranging ways and its effects on perceptions of overseas.
Okay, well, we are now at time. So, as we close out this excellent event that certainly foreshadows an excellent project to come, I would like you all to join me in really congratulating Margaret Myers on her fellowship here at the Wilson Center, and all best wishes on this project, and also for Bruna Santos on her incisive comments on the regional implications of China's changing diplomatic role in Latin America.